All right, welcome back. Happy New Year.
Happy New
Um,
Year, everybody.
yeah, so we didn't record last week, so this is technically the first new episode of 2025. The first episode that dropped in 2025 is a rerun. Um, but yeah, first episode recording in 2025. We're starting this one off with a question about some pedaling drills. So this question comes from Kirk. Kirk says, "Hi, fellas, uh, and Caitlin. Really enjoy really enjoy listening to your podcast. I used to follow a cycling coach that stated zone 2 riding is a waste of time unless one is incorporating neuromuscular pedaling efficiency skills within the ride. For example, skills such as high cadence drills, 130 RPM for 1 minute, single leg drills, etc. What is your opinion regarding these skills, especially the single leg drills? Thanks so much, Kirk."
I don't
Mhm.
understand the school of thought. I feel like those are two separate things entirely. Zone two, and why would adding pedaling efficiency only
Yeah,
then make zone two? It doesn't,
Yeah, I'm
I
guessing
don't
this other
understand.
coach maybe is more of like in the camp of sweet spot training or something, that they just don't think that you should ever ride easy. I don't know.
I wonder if hypothetically this coach that this person is talking about, or not hypothetically, I wonder if this coach has changed their opinion on Zone 2 since Zone 2 has, in the last, I would say, 3 years, just blown up in popularity.
Maybe. Kirk says he used to listen to this coach, so maybe he stopped listening to them because they didn't believe in zone 2 training. I don't know.
Mhm.
I would say let's not focus too much on
Yeah,
the zone 2
let's
aspect, and
not
let's
I mean, that was the most egregious thing that was in his question, but let's not get bogged down in that because that wasn't actually his question.
right. So what are your guys' thoughts on pedaling drills?
So I will say that I'm open to being wrong, and if anybody wants to prove me wrong on this, I'm not like I don't have a super strong opinion on this. What I'm saying is like I am open to pushback here from either one of you guys or anyone else, honestly, on this topic. But I have looked into the research on um either low cadence drills or high cadence drills and how they affect cycling performance, and it's not very promising research. And I would say any form of high cadence training does almost nothing for you, according to the research. Low cadence training may be more effective, possibly, although I would say the research on low cadence training is very mixed. Like some studies show no results whatsoever, and some studies show maybe there's a result from low cadence training. Um, I think that from what I gathered from reviewing the totality of the research on cadence training was training at your preferred cadence is optimal. So just train at your preferred cadence.
I'm going to jump in and say I think there is a purpose for everything. Um, so high and low cadence training is perfect for people that are training for a single speed event. I would say it's necessary. Um, but the single leg drills, um, I would say I think it's a way to measure return to cycling post injury, checking smoothness and pedal stroke from one side to the other. And I think for the new cyclist, I always throw those in there as a warm up before, like, I don't know, a tempo session or something. And they're usually like, oh, those were really helpful. I noticed, my left side is a lot more smooth than the right side or whatever. But I think for the seasoned cyclist who had been doing it for years, I don't know that incorporating it on a regular basis is, like you said, I think at that point it doesn't improve performance.
Yeah, so Dylan, the some of the like performance studies that you were referencing, what are they looking for specifically?
So
When they're measuring
usually,
performance.
yeah, I mean, usually they could be looking at a number of different things, but usually what they're doing is they're having subjects do a protocol where, I don't know, they're doing some sort of intervals at high or low cadence, Maybe they have a group at doing the intervals at preferred cadence. So, high cadence, preferred cadence, low cadence. And then at the end of the study period, they see what the improvement in performance was in these groups. So they could be doing that in a number of ways. They could look at VO2 max. They could look at lactate threshold. They could, they could actually do a 5-minute test or a 20-minute test to see if power was higher. I actually particularly like those studies where they actually do a power test, because sometimes I feel like, okay, well, maybe some metabolic marker changed, but at the end of the day, bike racing is not about who has the highest VO2 max. It's actually about who crosses the finish line first. So, and yeah, I mean, those studies just don't, they just don't show very promising results. And I think maybe an argument that people could have is that,
I think that that's a study. I mean, I could be assuming here, but wasn't that like for road cycling? I can see.
Usually if they're going to do a study on it, like they're studying people on the train or in a lab.
Yeah.
Like they're not going to a trail and saying like climb this technical hill, because that's a completely uncontrolled environment.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, so I think the important thing to take away from that is they're looking at specifically power output, but not necessarily looking at the specific applications for why variable cadence could be relevant. So we live in 2025 now. Most drivetrains are 12 speed or even 13 speed now. So like there is an argument that if you can't find your preferred cadence with the gear range that we have available today, maybe your gearing is just off, because like you should be able to settle into your preferred cadence at in some gear that works for you, right? So like I could see that argument that like you don't really need to have that much varied cadence in your repertoire because you have gears for that. But I do think that different applications as far as like what discipline you're riding, I do think there are preferred cadence ranges that are different for the application. So like a time trial or road racing application might have a different preferred cadence range than gravel or mountain bike riding. And not necessarily like blanket statement across the board, but for specific, for each individual rider, your preferred cadence may change depending on what the discipline that you're riding is. So like I know for riding off-road, at least from my experience, my preferred cadence was always about 5 to 10 RPMs lower than on the road. You're dealing with variable terrain, vibrations in the bike that makes it harder to stabilize at times, and the more you're kind of like pedaling and bouncing organically just from the riding aspect, the more you're going to be moving around once you add in all those other undulations or variables from the terrain. So I could see like for me, if I have an athlete that is transitioning from road to gravel, that's an application where I might have them do some cadence drills just to see if they can figure out what their preferred cadence is on off-road terrain. And I would usually want them to do that on the terrain that's similar to what they're going to be racing or competing on most often. And I think this is super relevant for especially mountain biking. I would say mountain biking in particular is probably the one discipline where you may want to have the widest range of available cadence, because you have different things like trying to get up and over obstacles at certain times, or get through rock gardens, or maybe you're like pedaling a downhill and you've only got a small gear because you're on a mountain bike and you need to have a high cadence in your available range. Mountain biking to me is probably the one discipline that requires the widest available cadence range. So I could see, like I'll have some of my athletes that are more mountain bike focused do some cadence drills in the off season, partly just to mix it up. Like it's there's not that much as far as like important specific training we're doing in the off season specific for mountain biking, but cadence drills is just a way to like okay, let's just check where is your range at? Can you still hit 50 RPMs? Can you still hit 130 RPMs? And just kind of work through some of that.
Yeah, I would say it's like how Drew has mentioned food on a nutrition podcast. He doesn't want to look at any one food as bad. I don't think necessarily any one drill is, good or bad. You should never do it. It just has specific implications for it or applications for it where it's, if the, yeah.
Well, I do agree with Caitlin, what you said about like the single leg drills, like unless you're doing it for some kind of muscular imbalance, or, muscular deficiency that you're trying to overcome. I don't personally see the value in single leg drills. Like the only time I've ever needed to pedal with one leg was in cyclocross when you're like tripoding and pedaling through a corner with one leg. And that is like very rare. That's like pretty elite skill to even implement. So like to me, there's just not a lot of intentional like application with single leg drills unless it's specifically for overcoming some kind of imbalance, in my opinion.
So I'll speak to the single leg drills. I think the intention behind prescribing single leg drills is that you're forced to pull up on the upstroke when you're doing single leg drills.
Sure.
And so the argument is, okay, if you're doing this drill where you're pushing down on the downstroke and then pulling up on the upstroke, then maybe when you start using both legs, you'll also do that, and somehow that will improve your performance. The reality of the situation is that people don't pull up on the upstroke ever when they're cycling, including the elite of the elite cyclists do not pull up on the upstroke. I've also done research into this. When people ride a bike, they do not pull up on the upstroke, even with, modern clipless pedals where that is completely possible. No one does that. So it's not really worth practicing and trying to implement, because when you have both legs available to you, you will not do that when you're pedaling a bike.
So you're saying it's not something that's trainable. It just doesn't happen. Yeah.
Like when you have both legs available to you, and I think this is even more the case when you're actually going at doing some sort of maximal effort where you're exerting your body to the maximum limit, you're not going to pull up on the upstroke. You're using every bit of energy that you have to push down on the downstroke, and that's it.
Yeah. I've seen, I don't remember if it was reading an article or actually reading a study, but I know that I've seen reference of studies where they've compared power output on flat pedals versus clipless pedals, and it's like negligible, the difference.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. Which is surprising to people, right? Because people think that like, oh yeah, I can put out so much more power with my clipless pedals. But you just don't pull up on the upstroke. So, I mean, granted, clipless pedals put your foot in the right position so you don't get an injury, and they're lighter and they're more aero. And I mean, there's a ton of advantages to them, but pulling up on the upstroke is actually not one of the advantages of clipless pedals, surprisingly enough.
Yeah. Now, the one application that I think maybe is anomalous here is either track cycling or single speed riding, where you're doing 30 RPMs at times, it's like track starts, let's say, or single speeding, when you're completely under geared. That's like the one application when the cadence is super low, talking like well below 50 RPMs, where you actually can feel and you do pull up on the upstroke, but that's only because the timing is so slow that you can, like you can consciously think about that. But that's it. Like I otherwise I agree, Dylan. I don't think there's anything to show that pulling on the upstroke is relevant.
Yeah. Timing is low and the torque is high.
Torque's super high. Yeah, exactly.
So, I mean, to answer this guy's question, when somebody prescribes pedaling drills, I'm not like super up in arms about it. It's kind of like when somebody prescribes stretching. Like if you want to stretch, okay, like that's not a bad thing to stretch. I just don't prescribe either one because the research doesn't suggest that either one is beneficial. So
cool. Anything else, Kaylin?
No, I'd say I just mix it in every once in a while as part of a warm up on a trainer workout. I just think it's engaging. Yeah.
One thing we didn't we didn't really touch on is that you can train your preferred cadence. I sort of maybe alluded to that a little bit, but like that's maybe an application where if I see someone that comes in, let's say they're a new cyclist, or again they're switching over from road to whatever. A lot of times actually triathletes switching over from triathlon to bike racing, where you'll see like their quote unquote preferred cadence is at like 60 to 70 RPMs, like just super slow, kind of grinding it out. Very common in triathlon. That's maybe an application where, again, you might want to train preferred cadence to like increase, because you probably don't want to have a preferred cadence of 60 to 70. We're looking more somewhere in the 80 to 90 RPM range probably. So like you can train that, and that just takes time. I don't know that cadence drills are necessarily the only way that you get there. I think just riding your bike a lot on different terrain is probably going to be the best way to get there, but cadence drills can be one way to maybe help accelerate that transition. All right, let's move on to, we got a question here from Carrie. Or no, they're from Carrie. Ken. This is from Ken. Ken says, should I be concerned that my heart rate this year has declined 5 to 10 beats per minute with my increased volume? Although I feel some fatigue, it doesn't feel like it's too much. I can still push my heart rate to max if I go all out for a few minutes a couple of times. Power for 1 to 2 hours is still strong. RPE has declined a bit as well, but not as much as my heart rate has declined. Thanks, Ken.
Yeah, that's normal, I would say. In fact, highly trained athletes will have a lower exercising heart rate even at the same relative intensity level as untrained. So obviously, if you're trained, your heart rate is going to be lower at the same power output. But I mean like relative intensity level. So their zone 2 or their zone 3 or their zone 4 or their max heart rate, it actually decreases. I don't know how well trained Ken was before versus now. He said volume's higher. I mean, I've noticed personally when my volume is super high at certain points, heart rate is naturally lower. So I don't think that it's something to worry about necessarily. And 5 to 10 beats per minute is not a crazy amount. If he said, oh, my zone 2 heart rate was 150 and now it's 110 or 120, maybe that would be cause for concern, but 5 to 10 beats per minute is not.
Yeah, suppressed heart rate can be a sign of fatigue, but he put in 2 really good pieces of information in there that he's still able to reach max heart rate, and RPE has gone down. So yeah, I think that's a sign that he's just adapting in a good way.
Yeah. Had he said RPE had gone up, that would maybe be a concern. But I agree with everything you guys said. I even see this with myself or with other highly trained athletes, where you come out of like an off season where you've had 2 months of minimal training and, your relative fitness is much lower than it was peak season at the end. And you go off for an endurance ride, and even though RPE feels normal, heart rate might be 5-10 beats higher than you'd expect. And that's just a little bit of a sign of, some detraining, some your body's not quite as adapted to the stresses that you're putting on it. So yeah, I agree. I think actually to see this is just a good sign. You know, it's definitely not alarming, and it actually can, you know, it shows some level of progress here. I would assume, without seeing any more data.
Mm-hmm.
All right, cool. Well, that was a quick one. Let's move on to this last one. This one comes from Phil. Phil says, "I'm a 64-year-old cyclist and have been riding for fitness, 3 to 4,000. So I'm guessing that's miles. Riding for fitness 3 to 4,000 miles per year for around 35 years. Wow. However, I was diagnosed with cancer on my 60th birthday. After 18 months of treatment and recovery, I was able to get back on the bike in February of 2022. That's awesome. Congrats, Phil. That's super cool. Since then, I've been on a path to get as fit as possible and have increased my volume from 3 to 4,000 miles a year before diagnosis to just over 7,000 miles in 2024. I do structured, periodized blocks of training, typically around 15 hours a week with 2 days off. Typically 3 days endurance and 2 days of intensity. But I struggle with how hard to make my intensity sessions. I normally do fine with a tempo and threshold session, but really struggle recovering from VO2 max or anaerobic or neuromuscular sessions. How do you measure the stress of these sessions other than using RPE? I'm considering using lactate testing to determine the stress of intensity workouts in order to get a better idea of the stress from those sessions. My hypothesis is that a session that produces he says M per, is it
too many millimoles?
Yeah.
Of lactate?
2 millimoles.
2 millimoles of lactate?
I don't know if that's the right units there. But anyways, yeah, 2 millimoles of lactate is twice as stressful as a session that produces 1.5 or less. And a 4 millimole session is twice as hard as 2. But it gets tricky after 4 since lactate rises logarithmically. Love to hear your thoughts on this. Thanks, Phil.
Dang. Really diving into lactate levels and stress levels here. Okay, so I would not necessarily say that 1.5. What did he say? 1.5 is twice. 2 is twice as stressful as 1.5.
Yeah. So in the units should be millimoles per liter.
Yeah,
that's what was throwing me off.
So, look, everybody's a little bit different with their lactate. I know that you know, a lot of people put their lactate threshold around 4 millimoles, but it's not necessarily 4 millimoles. Anybody who's actually done lactate testing can tell you that the point at which lactate spikes it's not necessarily perfectly 4 millimoles. So just take that into consideration. But I would say that you know, if you're trying to, as far as how stressful and the other thing too is that some people can hit super high lactate levels and some people can't. You know, some people could go up to, you know, 15 millimoles and some people can go up to 8 millimoles, whatever. So the amount of stress rises exponentially with kind of the rise in lactate levels. So 4 millimoles, just because that's double 2 does not necessarily mean that it's double the stress level. And I think he was actually getting at that because he said the difference between 1.5 is 2 is also double. Mm-hmm. I don't necessarily know how he's quantifying stress level here, right? There wasn't really a way to quantify that in the question. But I mean, I think he's getting at an important point, which is that as intensity increases and as millimoles of lactate increase with the increased intensity, stress increases exponentially, not linearly. So if you're doing, I don't know, VO2 max intervals and you only did say 20 minutes of work at intensity, that can be as stressful or more stressful, probably more stressful in Phil's case, than doing an hour of tempo or an hour of 40 minutes threshold or something. So I think Phil's getting, I'll be honest, I think Phil's getting a little bogged down in the details with trying to get the exact stress levels from a given lactate here. Like personally, that's not even something that I concern myself with when I'm doing intervals, is like, what's the exact stress level from this exact level of lactate. Mm-hmm. And I'm not saying that no one should ever consider that. Maybe there's riders in the Tour de France that are considering that, but that's like, sometimes I do feel that people get like lose what's the saying? Lose the forest for the trees.
Yeah.
I don't know if I said that correctly, but I feel like this is a perfect example. Or like when somebody gets really bogged down in a certain Training Peaks metric, it's like very, very minute details are causing you to lose the bigger picture here. So I'm not saying that this isn't an interesting concept to debate and think over, like what are the stress levels from a given lactate level. But I do, as far as actually achieving your goal of becoming as fit as possible, I do kind of feel like this is losing the forest for the trees here.
Yeah, so I just want to jump in and say I don't think Phil here, because we've got, I'm sure, tons of listeners that are Training Peaks fanatics. I don't think Phil is just referring to training stress here. So like, we're not talking about the TSS from these rides that Training Peaks or Garmin or whatever whatever algorithm they use to calculate what your training stress is from that day. He's talking about the stress that is implied to his like nervous system, like how much stress is his body undertaking. We're not looking at a specific metric here, because everyone has probably done a 3-hour endurance ride. Most people that are listening, and usually a 3-hour endurance ride is going to be right around 100 TSS. If you go out and you do a really hard VO2 max session or an anaerobic like Tabata style interval session, you could hit 100 TSS in an hour. And those two workouts are so different. You're going to feel that way different the next day if you hit 100 TSS in an hour versus 100 TSS in 3 hours. So I think that's kind of what he's getting at here. Is I'm guessing it's that he says he really struggles to recover from VO2 max or above. I'm guessing he's talking about like subsequent days. He's not talking about individual like efforts within a session. He's talking about, okay, he does a VO2 max workout or an anaerobic workout, and he feels that for multiple days afterwards. And that's the effects of the stress effect that these workouts are having on his body.
Yeah. So if you there's research done by Steven Seiler to suggest that any training above your zone 2, as many people put it, but above the first lactate turn point. And I want to say first lactate turn point and not use a specific millimoles, because that lactate turn point could happen at a different millimoles for different people. But any training above the first lactate turn point will have some sort of stress on your autonomic nervous system. And if you keep it under the first lactate turn point, or in zone 2 is commonly referred to, you're not excessively stressing your autonomic nervous system. Which is kind of where the theory of polarized training comes in. It's like you do a lot of training under that stress response, and then you do a little bit of training over that stress response, and that will give you the best result. And that little bit of training over the stress response, you should really make that count. And it should be appropriately high intensity. It shouldn't just be junk miles where you're, I don't know, kind of going over it a little bit, but not really getting the most out of your body. So I don't know
So
how to get
to
to
that point, for Phil here, Phil's considering purchasing lactate testing equipment to be able to do some lactate testing on his own. I think that might be a better application. Let's use that lactate testing to determine what is your LT1 and your LT2. So that way on your zone 2 days, I know he says he spends 3 days a week riding endurance, but maybe Phil's riding too high into his endurance range. So does Phil know exactly where that LT1 takes place? And also, I think, like you mentioned, like there's a lot of different ways to skin the cat as far as what the intensity is. It could be hard here with Phil's case, because if he's struggling to recover from those harder than threshold sessions, we got to be strategic with how you periodize it so that you're not just hitting the same energy systems, month after month and training block after training block. You got to, mix in the stimulus, but maybe Phil doesn't need as much stimulus in those harder efforts. You mentioned like making it count. Part of the way you make it count is, one, you don't overdo it on your easy days. In order to like be really efficient on your hard days, you have to like make your easy days easy. So that's like something we talk about. But also like maybe he's trying to do too much. Maybe, a traditional VO2 max training block might start with, let's say, 4x4 efforts and work up to 6x4 or 8x4 or something like that. But maybe 4x4 is too high of a starting point for Phil. Maybe Phil needs to start at like 3x3, something that's a little bit easier to chew, and you kind of like work up to that. Or maybe Phil just throws in one training block of VO2 max, 1, 2, or 3. For him, he's 64. I'd probably put him in like a 2-week on, 1 week off cycle. Or I usually do 16 days on, 5 days off for those athletes. So it's kind of like a little bit of abbreviated training recovery week, but allows us to get more frequent recovery in. That's something to consider too here. We haven't talked about recovery at all for Phil, but maybe Phil just does like one VO2 max block where he's just doing 2 weeks of VO2 max, and then he goes back to his other training just to like get a little bit of a varied stimulus in there without overdoing it, and give yourself that chance to recover after 2 weeks. There's just different ways that he could approach mixing in some of those harder efforts, I think.
Yeah. So
Caitlin,
Phil hasn't.
Yeah,
Caitlin, you want to go?
Yeah, I was just going to say, anyone can notice going from a 15-hour week where your intensity sessions are tempo or threshold to a 15-hour week where your intensity sessions are VO2 or anaerobic capacity. You're going to feel a lot different in that week. And I hate to be the bad guy to mention his age, but at 64 years old, that's going to be compounded, and you do need more recovery. And I think focusing in on how to improve your recovery and give yourself, more recovery if needed, is going to have more of an impact than diving down into the details of, lactate. I think the more reliant we can become on the signals that our body is giving us and being in tune with RPE, and I guess I almost feel like the metric of HRV is pretty important for this as well. But the more reliant we can be on our bodies to tell us how we're actually feeling, the better, instead of being so reliant on these other metrics that we don't have all the time. Like, unless we do come, like, a continuous lactate monitor is available to everyone, like, you can't, rely on that. It's almost like, being dropped in a new place and you're reliant on Google Maps to get you everywhere, and then suddenly you don't have it and you're like, I don't know how to get from here to there. Like, you need to be aware of your body. Like, you need, like in that example, aware of your surroundings. So yeah, and I think recovery should be his main focus. And we've mentioned before, an athlete at that age, it's better to do a 3-week cycle maybe instead of a 4-week cycle, where every 4th week is a recovery week, maybe every 3rd week is a recovery week. I think he mentioned 2 recovery days in a week, which is great. But, maybe there can be something different there.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think that so I'm going to guess that Phil's a numbers guy, and he really wants to do things objectively, not subjectively. And I would say I fall in that camp too. I would prefer to do things objectively instead of subjectively. But I'm going to be honest. Sometimes training and training properly requires subjectivity and listening to how your body feels, as opposed to having an objective number to go off of. And I think HRV is an interesting one because I've used HRV in the past and I don't use HRV anymore because I'm going to be honest. What I initially thought was really cool about HRV is it's giving an objective number to a subjective experience that people have, which is being tired, right? Before HRV, people are like, oh, well, I'm tired today. I'm not tired today. I feel good today. I don't feel good today. And HRV is giving you a number and it's saying, this is how good you feel. This is how bad you feel. It's objective. It's not subjective. And I'm just going to be honest. When I used HRV, the objective number it gave me rarely lined up with subjectively how I felt. And I know that Phil's not asking specifically about HRV here, but I think it kind of falls into the same camp. Sometimes, and I know this is going to irk the real objective numbers people here, but sometimes training is subjective, and you have to go with how your body feels, and you're not going to have a number to tell you how you feel.
Yeah, I agree. I would say not sometimes. I would say training is very subjective.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why, as coaches, one of the most valuable aspects of a good, sustainable coaching relationship is consistent communication. So, like, as coaches, we rely on daily input from our athletes, usually in the form of Training Peaks comments. That's kind of at least for me, that's the method that I use for communicating with my athlete on a daily basis. If they don't leave a comment and I'm just going off of what their metrics say, 3 months could go by between one athlete that's like, I'm just looking at their data, and another athlete where I'm using their data and their subjective input. And by the end of those 3 months, their training plans could look completely different because I was missing something with the athlete that wasn't giving me constructive feedback on their workouts, and overlooked, fatigue, signs of fatigue, or signs of, undertraining, different things that subjectively is the only way to like portray that, because objectively just looking at the data doesn't tell the whole story. And I'll use that to an athlete's advantage. If I don't necessarily adhere strictly to 3 weeks on, 1 week off, or 2 weeks on, 1 week off. If I've got an athlete that they're feeling pretty good and we've got a big race coming up and it's like, hey, I think it's going to be worth it to push one more week. You're showing signs of you're feeling great, hitting the numbers. We might push on an extra week and just say, like, let's see, can we push on one more week, or can we push on 5 more days? Get a little bit more out of this training block and push that recovery a little bit closer to the event, to get a little bit, greater adaptation from this training block. Or maybe an athlete, like, they're showing signs of fatigue 2 weeks into a block, and I'm just like, hey, let's cut this block short. Let's get you some recovery again. Maybe you've got signs of, early sickness, or, residual fatigue from a big training block we did 2 months ago that's just now creeping in. Like, without that subjectivity, it's really easy to overlook different signs of, stress levels, fatigue, or even just like how great someone's feeling. Like, just the data alone doesn't paint the whole story. And I agree. I think that's kind of what Phil, he's sort of answering his own question in some ways here, where he talks about how he like doesn't feel good when he does some of these VO2 max or anaerobic sessions. And I would say, that's a sign that something's got to change. Either he needs to just accept that he's not going to integrate those into his training plan, or he's got to change something to allow those adaptations time to set in properly.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. The I just want to say one more thing on lactate testing. I don't know if Phil's actually gone down this route. He seems to know a lot about lactate testing already, and I don't know if he's just read about it on the internet or if he's actually done it himself. I will say that lactate testing, if you've not done it yourself, seems amazing. You're like, oh yeah, I'll do lactate testing. I'll know my first lactate turn point. I'll know my second. And then I'll check myself while I'm riding and see if I'm in my zone. It's so much more of a pain in the ass than you realize. It sucks. It's not like you have to prick your finger, and then the chances that you get a bad read are like over half, and you have to like get more blood out. It's so much more of a pain in the ass than you realize. Which is why I keep harping on this continuous lactate monitor thing, because it would change training the way the power meter did if you could actually just know your lactate levels at all times. Because honestly, I think that for 99%, more than 99%, I think like 99.9% of athletes, and I include myself in the 99.9% here of athletes, I think that doing any sort of lactate testing or check, well, I don't want to say testing your lactate just to know your turn points is okay, but any sort of lactate checking while you're actually training is too big of a pain in the ass for it to be worth it.
Yeah. Agreed. Well, Caitlin, anything else to add?
No, I don't think so.
Okay.
Yeah, we've tried it. And even with Blaine on the trainer and me stepping in and trying to do it, like he's sweaty, you get a bad reading. Like if the strip touches your skin, it's tough. And those little strips like are what, $2 a piece? I don't know.
Yeah, it's just it's if you've not actually tried it before, I think all it takes is for people to try it a handful of times and just realize that it's not the foolproof solution that you think it is. It really is not.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're only going to glean information that you already have a pretty dang good like estimate of. You know, it's like your LT1 might be, I don't know, 10 to 20 watts off of what you expected it to be. In LT2 might be even tighter than that because, you know, FTP testing is kind of tried and true at this point. You know, so like you're only going to, you're going to get a, finer understanding of what those LT1 and LT2 markers are and what and maybe what your body's doing, how it's responding, in between those and in above, 4 millimoles of lactate. But at the end of the day, I mean, like we've got power meters, we've got heart rate, we've got RP, like we've got so much data already at our disposal that like it's probably not going to change. And I think that's what you're getting at, Dylan. It's not going to change your training enough for it to really affect anything.
Yeah.
So it's cool to know. And if you're a numbers person and you just enjoy that process, I think it's totally appropriate to do. But just know, like, this is not going to be the thing that probably pushes the needle of your training.
I agreed. So cyclists talk a lot about marginal gains, right? Like oversized pulley wheels, faster tires, more aero helmet. I mean, there's even marginal gains in training, like, is this specific interval, maybe it's a marginal gain because whatever. Anything could be a marginal gain, right? But as far as I would put lactate, I want to differentiate between lactate testing, like testing for your first lactate turn point and your second lactate turn point. I think that's okay. I'm not suggesting that people do that, by the way, but I think that's okay to do because at least you have an even finer, more better understanding of where those turn points are. And I think that's great. And then you can go out and you can use your heart rate monitor and your power meter to make your training even more perfect than it already is. I want to say lactate checking like as in checking your lactate levels while you're training, either on the trainer
training
or
with
even
lactate.
worse,
Yeah.
outside. I think that's so much of a marginal gain for such a huge amount of effort and headache that I actually think it borders on not a gain anymore. Because you having to actively think about doing this and then stop your workout and then check your levels and then get a bad reading and then get frustrated and then have to go and do another interval. I think that it's so much headache that you actually didn't gain one single thing from it. Like, you didn't get any faster because you did this. That's my personal opinion. Yeah.
I would agree.
I agree.
All right. Well, Phil, hopefully that helped. Just want to say again, that's it's awesome that you're able to overcome cancer and get back to training twice the volume. I mean, that's just crazy. I think you're only a year into this increased volume. I think just doing the increased volume alone is you're gonna see fitness like you haven't seen before. So I would just say monitor your fatigue levels based on subjectivity and how you're feeling, and just keep pushing. I mean, that's awesome. 7,000 miles in 2024. That's crazy.
Yeah. Nice job, Phil. We're proud of you.
All right, guys. Well, thanks for that. We'll see you guys next week.
Sounds good.
Sweet.